right on it. But we are going to be talking with 5 winemakers and wineries today. So I'll introduce them briefly before we jump into this, starting with, we'll just do a little wave so we can move through because we have so much to cover this morning. So we will start with Scott Caraccioli from Caraccioli Cellars. Give a little wave. Steve Mcintyre from Mcintyre Vineyards. Hello, good morning, Steve. Johnny Abate of Shalom Vineyard. Looking so light and lit and wonderful. And Ian Brand, owner and winemaker of I Brand and Family, who just gave us a wonderful dissertation on all things guitar. Thank you very much, Ian. And last but certainly not least, James Ewart of Diora Wines, representing San Bernardi. We're very excited to talk about San Bernardi today. I can't say it, San Bernardi. I'll get it by the end. We are definitely going to be jumping into some more specified topics as we go through our discussion today, but I'm going to kick it off to Renee Quigley, who I hope some of you are already familiar with. Most of you are already familiar with. Brenna is an amazing talent of all sorts. I'm going to read her bio because it is lengthy and I don't want to miss anything. Brenna is now living, she's from Napa Valley or Napa, California. Committed to thoughtfully applying the science and geology of the world of wine through both education and hands-on vineyard investigations. She worked with wine professionals in all areas of the trade, from growers in France to importers and buyers in the US, in order to precisely define the most impactful elements of their terroirs in a relevant and approachable manner. And we sure do appreciate that, Brenna. It's really, really helpful for sommeliers like me. Brenna received her bachelor's degree in aquatic biology and geology from the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2012, where she stayed on to earn her master's in geology with Dr. Phil Gans in 2015. Her research focused on geologic mapping and structural geology, how and why rocks deform, which I'm sure she's going to be breaking down today a little bit. And she has also worked extensively in the mining industry, where she further developed skills in geologic mapping and interpretation, soil sampling, and geophysical surveying. Brenna, there is nothing you don't do. I'm very impressed already. This is going to be an amazing, amazing seminar. She's going to kick it off right now. Before we get into sub-appellation tasting conversation and introduce the geologic setting of Monterey County and how it forms the terroir. So, Brenna, the show is yours. Enjoy. I'll be keeping us on track just in case, and I will turn over my screen to you.
Okay, great. Thank you guys so much. I wanted to just quickly start off by saying thank you to all of you for having me, and for all of you here kind of following along on our getting started on our geologic journey. And of course, specifically thanking all of the winemakers that we have here today. I also kind of wanted to step back for a quick second and say that this webinar that will happen in the next hour and a half has also been almost a year in the making. I've been working with all of these winemakers, and particularly talking a lot with Diora, who we'll kind of finish off with, about really spending some time to dive into the terroirs of Monterey. It was, embarrassingly, I have lived in California for 12 years and been working in wine for, about half that time. And Monterey County is still relatively new, and a year ago was much newer for me. And so it's really been a deep investigation into all of this, and gosh, I don't know what season it is now, if it's winter or spring, but a few months ago, when I guess it was summer, if that makes sense, I spent some time in Monterey with all of these growers, and I wanted to thank you all for taking the time to take me through your vineyards and drive me through the different AVAs and appellations, and really kind of start to piece things together. And thank you all for being here and participating and watching and being a part of this conversation. So I hope I can walk you through some of what we learned, and mostly learn from all of you guys as well. So as Amanda said, I'm going to start off by as quickly as possible, jumping in to place us within the geologic context of not only Monterey County, but how Monterey County fits into the geologic story of California. So if we jump to the next slide.
Sorry, one second. There we go.
All right. So here, this image here just shows basically the state of California and the major topographic features of California. So all of that kind of shading, we have this hill shading that shows kind of major mountain ranges and whatnot. And then the colored lines, which are a little blurry, but they're kind of highlighted lines that cut. They're not just drawn on lines on this map, they're actually topographic features as well. They're kind of linear features that you can see on a topographic map of the state. And those lines represent all of the major fault boundaries that are happening throughout California. So number one takeaway, California is a very diverse place. It's a very topographically diverse place, and it's a very tectonically, seismically active place. And that, of course, is primarily due to the very famous San Andreas Fault zone. And I always like to be kind of careful when we talk about the San Andreas to say that we talk about the San Andreas Fault, but it's really a fault zone. So it's this kind of interconnected system of faults. So system of cracks and breaks in the Earth's surface. And they're all kind of related to each other. They're all essentially, all of those highlighted lines on this map are all, you can think of them as kind of boundaries where movement is happening on either side. So those boundaries are essentially accommodating for the movement that these different tectonic plates are producing as they move with respect to each other. So Amanda's going to highlight the major trace of the San Andreas Fault zone throughout California. And so from the north, it kind of cuts through. So it actually kind of like slices right through the Bay Area, right where many of us are right now, and then kind of curves its way down into Southern California, where it makes a big bend and then kind of veers off into more central California, such as the Mojave Desert. And so the most important thing to notice here is that that fault zone, it's a huge, huge fault zone, and literally is separating two giant tectonic plates. So it's essentially separating all of North America, so the entire North American continent, pretty much, on the eastern side, on the right, from the Pacific plate. So the majority of the Pacific Ocean is all on one plate. Those two land masses, huge, huge, globally huge land masses, are moving with respect to each other. So North America is moving to the southeast very slowly. You can think of North America going like this. And the Pacific plate is moving kind of up to the northwest. So they're going like this. And that's been happening at a rate of something along the lines of 3 centimeters per year. So by 3 centimeters per year, we mean you can think of it a little bit like the length that your fingernails grow. And that 3 centimeters per year has been happening, that movement's been steadily happening for the past 28 million years. So it feels, I think, tectonic plates moving as fast as your fingernails sounds pretty fast, but even so, it's kind of a slow thing to think about. But if you extend that for 28 million years, you actually can do some damage, and you can create some pretty different things. So specifically, we are, as I mentioned, we're going to zoom now into Monterey County. So if you could highlight the San Andreas again, that orange line there, exactly. So we've got, that's the very southern tip of the San Francisco Bay at the north of the screen. And then it slices right through. So it's kind of like just east of the Salinas Valley and just east of Monterey County. There's actually a little sliver of the North American plate in Monterey County. However, all of the vineyards within Monterey County, all of the vineyards and the AVAs that we're going to be talking about are all on the Pacific plate. And so again, I just want to point out here that once again, the San Andreas Fault zone is a whole zone of interconnected craziness, because all of this all of this motion has to be accommodated for somehow. And then there are all of these subsidiary faults. So all of those other highlighted lines on this little screen here show that there's other movement happening. And again, it's sort of just how all of that movement gets accommodated for. So there's the major motion of this happening, but then there's all of these kind of like wrinkles. You can think of them wrinkles or splays off of this major system. And that really ends up setting up the topography, which ends up setting up not only the geologic exposition and diversity of Monterey County, but also the climatic diversity of Monterey County, because this topography is going to really influence how temperature changes from one region to the next. So then as we kind of zoom in, sort of kind of take out the faults here and now look more at how that looks topographically. So kind of from an aerial view, we're going to break this down in terms of what we would call a fancy word, but geomorphological features. So how this tectonic setting really does set up these different mountain ranges. So again, just to be nice and repetitive, we'll point out the San Andreas Fault Zone again, how that sort of slices, oops, sorry, sort of slices down through that edge of the map. And then it's kind of a faint green line, but you can actually see the trace of Monterey County. It has that little hook right above where it says San Andreas. Yeah. So that line there is Monterey County. Nope, that's the next one. But
oops, sorry.
We'll see it on the next image a little bit better. But so you can just see that there is that little slice. So the majority of Monterey County is here on the Pacific Plate, and just that eastern little edge, the southeastern little edge, little slice of North America is still recorded essentially within Monterey. So the Salinas Valley kind of starts up in that kind of northwestern corner there, and you can see the Monterey Bay, that nice little hook of the Monterey Bay. And what I love about Google Earth is that not only does it show the topography of the land, but it also shows the underwater topography of kind of what's going on below the surface. So you see that deep ravine within the Monterey Bay. If you can point out that kind of dark.
Sorry, Brenna, 1 second. A couple of people are saying the map is not showing up, so I just want to try to figure out what's going on here, why it's not up there. We go here.
I see
I don't know
it.
if that's better. You see it? Okay, great. Yeah, maybe for those of you who aren't seeing it, maybe just go ahead and check your settings to make sure that you're in the proper view. But sorry, Brenna, one more time. You're looking for down here?
No, up to the Monterey Bay. So again,
Perfect.
that's northwest, and you see that deep. So it's this actually really deep underwater canyon, and it's referred to throughout Monterey County. They call it the Blue Grand Canyon. So it's kind of, if you can imagine the image of the Grand Canyon on the Earth in Arizona, imagine the underwater version of that here. So there's this really, really deeply incised, steep canyon off of the coast of the Monterey Bay. And it essentially holds all of this really, really cold water. The deeper the water, the colder it is. And that basically allows for all of this cold water, this cold marine air, to begin filtering into the Salinas Valley. And so not only does that make it so that it's very cold, I think a lot of us, when we imagine places like Monterey and Carmel, we imagine that really, really classic Northern California, cold, foggy, windy, climatic setting. But it also creates this pressure gradient because it's so much warmer inland. So it just literally sucks. So the valley itself kind of sucks all of this cold air into the valley, and you get these really, we'll talk about it a lot the more we talk with each of the individual producers. You get this really intense wind that blows down the valley. And so then on either side, so we have the Salinas Valley that kind of moves through Monterey County, kind of almost parallels the shape of the county itself. And then the valley is bounded by the Gavilan Range, on the east, so these kind of granitic mountains here. And then there's actually 2 ranges on the western side that border, or that kind of create the Salinas Valley. So we often talk, because we talk about the Santa Lucia Highlands, which we will talk about the Santa Lucia range, but actually right in front of them is a smaller kind of granitic schisty range called the Sierra de Salinas. And another thing that I think is really interesting to point out here is that the Salinas Valley is essentially, I think it's about 90 miles long. But down at the very bottom of the map, we have Paso Robles. And so you can, and just, I think that's a good thing in terms of wine, wine references to think of. If you put 2 climate images in your head, we have Paso Robles here at in the south, kind of the south end of this Salinas Valley. And then we have Salinas and Monterey and Carmel up in that north end. And so we're really looking at these two kind of dramatic end members of this climatic spectrum. And so then if we jump to the next image, we'll see these are kind of similar thing, but this is how we're going to kind of visit our way through these different AVAs. So again, the Monterey AVA kind of follows the Salinas Valley, and then it's broken up into some of these smaller subregions and additional regions off to the side. So our journey for today is going to start in the northwest. So kind of starting at the Monterey Bay at the initiation of these powerful, famous winds of the Salinas Valley, and we're going to move our way down valley. So warming up as we go. So we'll spend some time in the Santa Lucia Highlands. We'll go to Chalon Vineyard, into where we're kind of, the vineyard is right outside of it, but we're going to talk quite a bit about Arroyo Seco and how it's unique, and then end farther down into the south in San Bernardino. So again, kind of following this journey of the wind. And then let's see. Okay, and so then this is sort of a summary, and we're going to come back to this map over and over again as we go from location to location. And this is really summarizing it's an attempt at summarizing all of those things that we talked about. So we're going to talk about these changing microclimates. We're going to talk about this geologic setting just off, just neighboring the San Andreas Fault Zone, the shape of the Salinas River Valley, and then how all of these different AVAs are kind of fitting into that story. So in order to, again, we'll come back to the details, but I kind of just want to give you a little sense of what's going on here. So this is essentially a geologic map. So all of the different colors on this map represent rock types that have been grouped together by approximately by their age and by their, by their genetic setting, by their broad similarities of the rock's actual kind of structure and texture and chemical makeup. But this is a huge region, so we had to do quite a bit of simplifying so that it was something that we could use that kind of made sense. But so one thing I want to point out is the first thing to look at are the differences between these kind of light, in the legend it says younger sediments. So there are these light kind of like creamy yellow orangey colors, which are essentially younger, we'd say unconsolidated, meaning kind of like loose sediments, to weakly consolidated sedimentary rocks. So we have things like, soft sandstones and shales and river alluvium and colluvium coming down the mountainsides and that sort of thing, versus some of those more kind of punchy colors of the pinks and purple and green, which are older. And when I say older, I mean, younger meaning around 10 million years or younger, older meaning we're talking upwards of 100 million years, kind of a thing. And they're harder crystalline rocks that have been deformed. So they've been faulted and folded and mixed up and have gone through a lot. So generally speaking, when we're in the northwestern portion of Monterey County, we're dealing with a lot more of these kind of crystalline rocks, these granites, schists, kind of deformed marine sediments. And as we move down valley, as we kind of follow the wind, we're going to get into more and more of these kind of younger compilations, younger assemblages of these marine sediments and alluvial materials. And okay, I think that kind of gives us, that was a lot of information and it was kind of quick. But don't worry, because we're gonna repeat it and we're gonna kind of live in it now. So that kind of sets up what we're talking about. And now let's get to the wines, so that it also gives us a little context for why we care about these things.
Yeah, thanks, Brenna. That was amazing. I'm really looking forward to diving into some of these specifics. As you said, very big appellation that we are going to be looking at with a little bit more of a microscope. So we are, and thank you for your timeliness on that stop. We are going to be moving to the wine segment of our webinar seminar today with Caraccioli Cellars and Scott Caraccioli. We will be continuing to screen share. So if you guys need to move around your little, I think we're all kind of on the side there. Just Scott and Brenna will be primarily talking. I'll be interjecting, but do continue to share your questions, and we'll be sure to ask them as time allows. Caraccioli Cellars was founded by Scott's father in 2006, and they continue to be family owned and run today, with Scott overseeing the marketing and day-to-day operations. And as I'm sure many of you know, Caraccioli specializes in the production of vintage method champenoise sparkling wines. They exclusively utilize Pinot Noir and Chardonnay coming from Santa Lucia Highlands. And today we are tasting the 2015 Brut Cuvée. So cheers if you've got it. And Brenna, I will turn it back to you just as soon as I turn the screen. There it is.
Great. Cheers. Cheers. So I was lucky enough to get to start my trip with Scott. And there's nothing better than starting a tasting or starting a wine trip with sparkling wine, especially delicious sparkling wine. So very excited to have this here, and very excited to get to kind of take you guys through some of the conversations that Scott and I had, which again, it was my first stop. So it's really fun to go back to, because when I think about it now, Scott, I think about like how much I learned in the short amount of time that we spent together. And, like I'm just the kind of person, like I can read as much as I can find, and I will, and do all this research and find all these maps. And it's just never the same as when you get your boots on the ground and you see what's going on. So the first thing that I want to talk about, we're going to jump right into this northern portion of the Monterey County, specifically the Santa Lucia Highlands, which again are a little confusingly actually at the base of the Sierra de Salinas range. And the first thing so just to kind of place this in context, there's a silly little X there that shows where we are. Again, base of the Sierra de Salinas, we're in this kind of benchland area of the Monterey County. But so when I looked, and I think it was just kind of silly, but I looked at these maps and I saw there were these kind of benches coming from the mountains. If we go to the next, there's a picture. I had a hard time capturing it myself, but if you could kind of, we see these kind of rugged mountain terrain that obviously doesn't have vineyards on it. That's at the kind of, the mountains, sorry. And then there's the valley floor at the bottom. And the main thing that I kind of forgot to mention about Monterey County is that, the valley floor is covered with row crops. And there's this huge history of, the Salinas Valley being, one of the most important agricultural areas in the country for row crops. And so the vineyards are kind of put up on this benchland. And for me, just when I was looking at it, I kind of imagined, and this is partially true, that this benchland is kind of this like uplifted terrace from the river. And so I was imagining to see a lot of alluvial river sediments, similar to basically the valley floor, but that had been popped up. And seeing it myself was so impressed, and kind of took me a second to wrap my head around, is that these are, especially here at Escol and with Scott, is that we're really not talking about, there is some sort of like interaction between between the mountains and the river valley, but we're really mostly talking about alluvial fan sediments that have been shed off of the mountains. So there's not a lot of rounded river cobbles. There's not a lot of clay at all. It's really this kind of broken down crystalline rock that A lot of it is called DG, decomposed granite. A lot of it's called granite, but especially this portion along the Santa Lucia Highlands it's actually decomposed schist. And it's specifically from the Sierra de Salinas. So there's a type of schist itself called the Sierra de Salinas schist, and that is kind of forming the majority of the source material for these sediments. And so you see the bottom image there to the bottom right, you have this terrace of these sediments. So they're sediments, they're loosely unconsolidated, they form these benches at the base of these mountains, but they're really made up of really kind of freshly broken down igneous rock, or we would say kind of crystalline basement rock. And so it's a really cool combination. And as you know, as obviously geology gets complicated, so there is a little bit of kind of river influence, and actually along the base of a lot of these terraces, there is kind of a fault that uplifted it. But so it's a very cool conversation to have. And I'm excited to hear, Scott, I think you're gonna tell us a little bit more about the wine itself and about the vineyard itself. And then I kind of want to jump into some of the conversations we had together as well.
Great, thanks, Brenna. It was really exciting to walk the vineyard with you and kind of hear your thoughts as we went through it and kind of link up what I think in terms of winemaking at a school and farming a school and what that really kind of means in amplifying what I see to be distinctive about the site. It was planted in 2008. It's 124 total acres, mixed mostly of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, mostly Pinot Noir dominant. It's mostly dry farmed since about 2016. I've irrigated it a handful of times when it definitely needed it, but really try to be minimal in terms of any type of irrigation, as well as really keeping a minimal fruit set, so I have a complexity and concentration of flavors that I feel are true to site. The Chardonnay is planted in a fan that is more sandy and more alluvial. And the wine that we're drinking today is 2015 Brut Cuvée. So it is 100% Escol. It's the first vintage that was 100% estate, and being able to hone everything in optimal pick points, as well as showcasing the vineyard in the best way, was really important when we made the transition completely to estate, which kind of started from 2013 to 15. This wine's 60% Pinot Noir, 40% Chardonnay. It's aged on the lees for 4 years, and then it's off on cork for about a year before release. Everything's harvested into small yellow bins, which really to us is important in preserving the overall freshness and sunshine and the place that matches with the process that is method traditional or champenois, where we're going through long lees aging, and really, to me, showcasing the acidity that makes Escol very distinctive from the standpoint that we don't do any malolactic fermentation on any of our sparkling wines. So we're really kind of leaning into the wind, so to speak, and getting able to showcase all of the savory minerality, the characteristics that the Chardonnay picks up, composed with the Pinot Noir on the DG as you get kind of upper onto the bench. And I think making a more light-handed, more reductive style of sparkling wine really leads to showing those idiosyncratic differences and site ultimately.
Yeah,
I think it absolutely does. And we've got a question I'd love to ask, because it seems like a few people are interested. If we have a second. Tim Marson is asking, is there a reason why the SLH AVA was named after the Santa Lucia range rather than the Sierra de Salinas upon which it lies?
That is a great question. And I have a feeling there are several panelists in this conversation who are ready to answer it before I am.
So do you want to answer, Brenna, or do you want me to save it for the end?
No, I think so. I think, I mean, Ian's got a look on his face that I feel like he's got a good answer. Or I think actually, Scott, I think maybe you and I talked about it as well. Do you have a good?
I'll let Ian take this one. I mean, it's a political appellation that was designed around vineyards that were existing at an inflection point in the history of grape growing in Monterey County. So I think it was more of a nod to the marine influence that the Bay has on the bench in the Salinas Valley, as opposed to lesser known Sierra de Salinases, I guess.
Yeah, I like it. Maybe we can kind of continue answering that question as we continue talking with different people as well, because it is an important thing to note. But in terms of this wine here, which is so beautiful, so I wrote down from our conversation, Scott, something that I've thought about several times since then, which I think I would really like you to go into more detail about. One thing you said to me is, you can't just pick anything early and make bubbles out of it, which I think is such a great and important point. And I think it's also exactly why your bubbles are so good and so delicious, is because you're not just picking early to make bubbles, you are making beautiful, thoughtful, complex, driven bubbles that are reflective of the Santa Lucia Highlands. And so I guess I would love to hear a little bit more about how you kind of make those decisions, and how the terroir specifically, this kind of the differences that you were talking about with the sandier areas for Chardonnay and more of that kind of DG stuff for the Pinot Noir, how that kind of goes into finding that complexity that you're looking for and how you make those picking decisions.
Yeah, I think it really kind of goes back to, while the vineyard's 124 acres, it's probably about 40 different blocks, 45 different blocks, all broken up clonally, rootstocks, based on what was found when the vineyard was in the investigation stage of being planted, and all of the pits were basically dug. And in having the right match of clone and place gives more opportunity to match ripeness and overall freshness of fruit with acidity. So you have the structure that will allow it to go through 4 years on lees and have everything still in balance, where it's not austere, it's not thin, and it's not overly fruity to where it takes away from the complexity of what adding 4 years on lees really does to a sparkling wine. And being able to know what clones do that makes it very more viewed from a position of overall making a dynamic cuvee. So there's clones, that 236, which was the rotor clone, that's in a spot where I know it's going to preserve a lot of acidity. I know it's going to come in with 11 TA at 19 bricks and hold it, as well as 2A, which is a Swiss clone, does very much the same thing. And then I have, for staying on Pinot Noir clones, a block of 115, where you get a little bit more of that lifted red fruit and just kind of bold roundness that people, I think, associate with SLH in terms of the bright red fruit. So as time goes on and we hone in exactly where we're harvesting from, when certain blocks start to dump acidity as they move from 19 bricks to 23 bricks, 24 bricks, and picking them at their optimal freshness, so you have this expression of sunshine and also the chemistry to undergo secondary and come out of it balanced and be something that's a cohesive expression, is really, clonally, as we progress as a brand, something that we've focused on in implementing more clones and more clones that we feel showcase themselves best at an earlier pick point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I hate to cut you guys off, but we do have to move to our next winemaker, and we've got a bunch of questions still coming in for Scott, so we'll save them for the end, if that's okay, Brenna.
Yeah, great.
Perfect.
Thank you.
There's our Sandy School. Yeah, thank you. We're going to be moving to Mcintyre Family Wines with Steve Mcintyre. Mcintyre Family Wines is located in the Santa Lucia Highlands AVA, and Steve is a renowned viticulturist who has planted more than 20% of the entire AVA. That's very impressive, Steve. Additionally, he has farmed nearly a third of its vineyards and vinified hundreds of wines from its grapes, making him an expert on the unique qualities of the Santa Lucia Highlands. I am very excited to be tasting this Pinot Noir. We've got the 2017 Mcintyre SLH Pinot. Brenna, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. So from a typical wine tasting perspective, we're just moving, just a little bit down valley. We're not moving too far, but I think the Santa Lucia Highlands are such an important part of Monterey County, and the Pinot Noir specifically from the Santa Lucia Highlands is such an important conversation to have with respect to these terroirs in Monterey County. I kind of want to split up this conversation in a couple different ways. So we're not making any big jumps in terms of the difference of the terroir here. I'm sure Steve can tell you more details about his vineyard and the uniqueness of that terroir. But what I really want to start off by doing is really have kind of a similar conversation to what we just had with Scott about how these terroirs work in this area, how that kind of broken down Sierra de Salinas schist in these kind of alluvial fan bench settings, how that terroir from sparkling wine then translates to Pinot Noir. So kind of similar conversation through a different lens of a different grape. And then because we're so lucky to have Steve here, who knows, this is his individual estate vineyard where we're drinking this Pinot Noir from, but he also, planted a huge portion of the entire region and farms a huge portion of the entire region. So I also hope we can spend a couple minutes discussing how these broader changes in geology influence his farming styles as well. So we're going to jump around a little bit here, but that's the goal of what we want to talk about next.
Well, thank you, Brenna. It was a pleasure to meet you out in the vineyard and learn a lot more about geology. It's something I should have paid more attention to in college. But yeah, this vineyard, very similar to Scott's vineyard in terms of terroir, soil type. The soil, it's an alluvial fan that these vineyards sit on. So they're quite deep, these soils. We've dug as deep as we can and haven't found the bottom of the same horizon. They're granitically based, as you mentioned, very well drained. And because of such a profile, we are able to, as Scott indicated, pretty close to dryland farming, and we only irrigate when it gets hot. I've had the good fortune of working with this vineyard, which was planted in 1972. It is 60 acres since we purchased the farm. March 1st, 1987, it was going to be abandoned. That's how crazy things were back in the late 80s. It was entirely Pinot Noir, planted on its own roots. We have no idea what the clone is. Back then, clones were not important and weren't kept track of frequently in the nurseries. So we started redeveloping the parts of it. We have Chardonnay now. We have the newer clones of Pinot. This wine that you're tasting contains many of those. There's 777, 115, Swan Selection, which we just love. And most recently, we planted some Calera 91 and some 948. And it's the terroir. I like to refer to terroir as everything we can't control as viticulturists. So there is the wind, there's the aspect ratio we face to the east, slightly northeast is the way the land lays, the road direction, trellis system. Of course, we can change trellis system. And then, of course, the most important thing is the marine influence, which regulates our temperatures and allows for a very, very long growing season to be able to get the vines ripe. I don't really like the term physiological ripeness, but it is pertinent when you're talking about the loading of carbon, the partitioning of carbon. There's sugar certainly where carbon goes and creates sugars. There's also the partition where carbon goes and creates all the beautiful things we're really looking for in the wine, the structure, the aroma, the flavors and such. So that's really what I think makes the Highlands so unique, is that maritime influence that we get. And what that really means is that as Brent, or I think it was Amanda indicated, it was Brenna. It does suck. The Salinas Valley does suck, but it's actually a very incredible place to grow just about anything. You know, when I moved there in '82, I thought, well, you know, this is a stepping stone. There wasn't much going on, but I am so glad that I've spent the last, 39 years working in the area, because I think it has tremendous potential, and it's not spoiled by a lot of urbanization or tourism just yet. So.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. There is this kind of, what I was really moved by throughout the entire trip that I spent there was this like really incredible combination of like it's not, I want to say like bucolic or pastoral, farm town combined with wine, but also combined with like really serious industry. And I think a lot that intersection of all of those different worlds, where there's this kind of like beautiful agricultural sense to it. There's kind of, this, image of vineyards and like the luxury of vineyards, but then there's also like this practical, really down to earth feeling to it that you just don't find in many wine regions anymore at all. And it feels like a hidden gem. But before we move on too quickly and away from the wine, I also want to point out that I think this is a really beautiful example of that Santa Rita Hills Pinot Noir. And I would actually really like Amanda's thoughts on it as well, because I think the nose and kind of the, there is a real marine sense to this wine aromatically that I get off of it right away. But then I think there's also this kind of great structure that you get from these kind of, that combination of kind of thinner sandy soils, but that are also really deep. I think like there's lots of different things going on here. And I'd be really curious, Amanda, your thoughts about how this kind of plays into what you think of as Monterey Pinot Noir, and also how that kind of fits into the bigger world of Pinot Noir.
Yeah, I mean, I think Scott pointed it out. We talked a little bit, touched on it when we were talking about the sparkling, but the ability to have the depth and complexity and the intensity of this wine while still having that lift and the freshness, like that to me is uniquely Monterey and some of these sub-appellations that we're talking about. So yeah, I mean, there's intensity, there's ripeness. This is a California wine for sure, but then you have like this incredible seashell thing going on, sort of this marine thing that you alluded to before. And you don't find that a lot of places in the world, and especially not in California. I think sometimes we talk about different appellations, lending themselves to more ripeness or lending themselves to more restraint, but you do really get a beautiful balance of both within this glass of salinity, restraint, and then intensity, which, you get all the wonderfulness that we love with the restraint, but you don't lose the body and the complexity and the intensity with that wine.
Yeah, absolutely. There's like a concentration to it without heaviness. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's like somebody's like squeezed a little lemon in like your very decadent dish and just brightened it back up.
Yeah. And I'm really glad that we kind of side by side with the sparkling. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hallmarks of the appellation is, as you referred to, the concentration. Many times we get accused of, or we've been accused as an appellation of adding Syrah or something to these Pinots. They do tend to be, not to be sexist, but somewhat masculine as opposed to other AVAs around the world. And I do attribute that to the long growing season where we partition, as I mentioned, a lot more carbon into the things that we're really looking for in a wine to make it delicious.
What is sort of the breakdown of days? Like when you say long growing season, how does that kind of compare to other growing season lengths? Specifically talking about like the Burgundy 100 days from flowering.
Yeah, there's about 1 o'clock between 12:30 and 1 o'clock every day during the growing season, except when you get to September, October, which are the best times to visit, we get a wind. And it's not just your afternoon breeze. It is, 15, 20 knots or 25 miles an hour. And that means that our maximum daily average temperature occurs at that time, whereas other growing regions, it might occur much later, especially in an area that you might specialize in Bordeaux varietals. So you might reach your maximum temperature at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's typical of Paso Robles, if you would be. So reaching that temperature earlier and then starting to cool off limits the amount of sugar that goes into that is created by photosynthesis in the vine, because sugar is rate and time dependent, as opposed to the other C6 and C5 carbon chains that we're talking about for flavor and aromas and structure. Those are time dependent, so they're not rate dependent. So the amount of heat in a given day doesn't accelerate that reaction within the vine. So that's why having that long growing season adds to the concentration of the wines that we're producing in the Highlands.
I love that. I'm gonna we wanted to show some of these soil sides as we get to our next winemaker, and I'm sure Brenna, you'll want to jump in here with the Monterey Formation, and then my favorite, the potatoes.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we'll actually kind of for kind of time and content as we went this way, I might ask you to pop back to these when we talk with Ian as well. Because Scott, we spent a little bit of time at his vineyard specifically, but he also, because he farms so much, we also did a little trip down the Santa Lucia Highlands, and as it kind of changed into, or as it kind of transitions into Arroyo Seco. And I also spent some time with Ian throughout Arroyo Seco as well. So we'll kind of maybe just jump back to that conversation then and jump into Chalone then.
Yeah, Chalone, one of our, definitely a vineyard and a wine that I am familiar with back, to the 70s. We had the luxury of drinking some of these oldies at press, and I'm sure some of you Napa aficionados will recall that the very first non-commercial vintage was made by Philippe Tongi. But Chalone, so much history within California, it can't be ignored. We will be tasting the 2018 Chalone Estate Chardonnay. We've got Johnny Abate from Chalone, who's been working as a winemaker there for some time now. He actually aspired to be a pharmacist, which I feel like if we had another whole chapter on, talking today, we would definitely dive into that, but landed in winemaking labs. He holds a degree in biological science and comes to Chalone with 18 years of winemaking experience, most recently as winemaker for Morgan Winery in Salinas. So I think we should jump into this gorgeous Chardonnay that we've got here. And Brenna, I'll let you take it away there.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, the history of the state cannot be overlooked, and hopefully Gianni can go into a little bit more of that too. But it's such an important kind of benchmark for California and for California wine. And I want to make sure we focus on that, but also geologically, it's like totally nuts. Like I can just honestly say that I have never been quite as confused in a vineyard as I was when we got here. And I did a lot of reading beforehand, and like everything I read, I was just like what am I going to see at this vineyard? Because nothing that I read makes sense, like something that I would expect to see. And I think because it's so historic and it's so important, and because people have spent a lot of time there, that we kind of, I found people writing quite casually about the fact that it's kind of like, oh yeah, there's granite, and then there's these, little lenses of limestone. And I'm like, you don't get like lenses of marine sediment typically forming in a magma chamber. That's not that's not like something that you expect to see. It's not like, oh yeah, there's just like a little ocean in the middle of molten rock, 5 kilometers underneath the surface of the earth. So I was just like, I don't know how we're gonna get here. Like, I don't know, is there really gonna be limestone when we get there? To be honest, I was kind of like, maybe there's just not limestone. Sometimes people like to call just, any white rock limestone. So maybe it's not really there. I don't know. And then sure enough, that's exactly what I saw. There's all of this, you know, intact granite. It's, you know, beautiful, crystalline. And then you like walk over a couple feet and there's a lens of solid marine sediment calcareous limestone, just with no explanation. The only thing that I could say about it was that it looked really disturbed. Like the limestone looked unhappy. It looked like it had been through a lot of weird events, which, you know, so, and my thinking is, okay, so there's, you know, we're right next to the San Andreas Fault. We're right next to the Pinnacles, which are, you can see here, absolutely beautiful. I had a beautiful little hike around the Pinnacles as I was sifting through these like very confused geologic thoughts in my head after we walked through this vineyard. And so the Pinnacles are these, they're Miocene, so young volcanic rocks. And so it's kind of like, all right, there's volcanic activity going on here. We're right next to the San Andreas. Like maybe there's some sort of, you know, marine shelf that got faulted down and it's just been juxtaposed against all of this granite. But then the more that we're walking around, it's just not the case. There aren't blocks. There aren't, you know, discrete blocks. There's kind of like blobs of limestone. And so throughout kind of looking up more and more maps and trying to figure out what's going on, basically what happened was this, you can think of, there's molten rock really deep under the Earth's crust that starts as it melts, it becomes more buoyant. So it wants to move up. So it wants to, you know, molten rock moves through the crust and it wants to erupt in a volcano. But as it gets there, it kind of moves through the crust and it kind of is moving through these old limestone sediments. And as it moves, it kind of rips off these like pendants of limestone into this magma chamber. And so these kind of blocks or, you know, lenses of limestone within all of this granite were essentially ripped off chunks of the country rock, of the wall rock that this granite kind of like grabbed onto and then somehow got preserved. And so the edges of these limestone blocks are kind of melted. We say like metasomatized. So they've just been kind of destroyed along the edges. Some of them have actually been contact metamorphosed. So they've actually recrystallized because of the heat of the molten rock around them and they've formed marble. But then on the insides, they're kind of this intact like limestone sediment. It's absolutely insane. I can say, I don't, you know, so here are examples of this like crazy stuff that you see. So you get this like really beautiful crystalline calcite. You can see those little boxy crystals of the calcite. It's kind of like a vein as this has been kind of, essentially that limestone was melted and then reformed into these beautiful crystals. On the right, you get that limestone that's been totally metamorphosed and it's actually been marbleized. So it's now kind of a metamorphic limestone, which is marble. And then the next one, here, the bottom left photo, you can see that some of that hard granite and it's got all these other like little chunks, that dark block kind of blob in the middle is kind of a different type of rock that was kind of blocked in. And then you get this kind of like beautiful white limestone as well. So geologically and terroir speaking, I cannot think of anywhere else in the world that has, like any other vineyard that has something like this going on. So really, really impressive. As far as thinking about terroir, so think about granite terroir, and you have, you know, you picture places like the Northern Rhone, you've got these shallow, weak, sandy soils that are very acidic. And then right next to that, you have these kind of alkaline, limestone, richer soils right next to them. So you have this huge spectrum of terroir that's going on in the middle of this historically very important place. So sorry that was so long, I can't help it. But Gianni, I'm so excited to talk with you and talk about our time that we spent there, and mostly just like learn more about, you know, how you manage these terroir differences so well in your winemaking.
When you were up at Chalon, you quite a few times had mentioned that this is very strange, and Chalon is a very strange place. you know, a lot of what Steve and Scott talked about the Santa Lucia Highlands as far as being, you know, very cool climate, very deep soils, those we don't have at Chalone. We have very shallow soils. So if you were to dig down, you know, 10, 12 feet, you would hit a hard pan. So a lot of these roots are growing on top of each other, really. And also we have the situation where we experience more sunshine in the morning. So on a typical morning, the Salinas Valley is covered with fog, and we're at 1,600 feet in elevation, and we're above that fog or that marine layer. So we see a lot more heat. We see a shorter season. So, you know, the hang time that you get in Santa Lucia Highlands, you know, if you take a couple weeks off that hang time, that's what we're dealing with at Chalone. And we have a lot of this limestone that really imparts a very chalky mineral, almost a salinity to our wines. So it definitely is a different, a lot different than the rest of Monterey County is concerned. We have a hard time growing up there. A lot of the people don't realize that Chalone is an appellation that could not survive without water. We need to water these vines, and we are usually watering them on a weekly basis because the soil is well drained, but the decomposed granite has not a lot of water holding capacity. So we are giving these vines essentially sips on a weekly basis as opposed to irrigating them heavily. And then we have the limestone that comes in and really gives it a nice mineral flavor. So it is a very strange place. When I began working at Chalone, I thought everybody was crazy because they're making Pinot Noir in 110-degree heat, and that's just something that you think is not possible. But for some reason, it works up at Chalone, and we get some really nice flavors out of the Pinot and good color extraction. And it is a strange place, and it's that strange place that I fell in love with and enjoy making wine out of.
Yeah, great. There was actually so many things that you said there that I actually, instead of asking a specific question, I just want to recap and highlight because they're so important. I got into the limestone thing. I should have said it to begin with. But so I want to make sure that we step back and we realize, let's go back to the Chalone map actually, or just the map that shows where we are, because I really want to point out, first of all, it's so important. So we're at 4, so it's in this, you know, eastern edge of Monterey County at all. You know, we're most importantly, I think, maybe at really high elevation. So we're no longer in the benchland. So we're not in these kind of gently sloping benches at the, you know, in between the mountain and the valley. We're in the mountains. So that elevation is a really important factor. And also it's important to note we just hopped over to the other side of the valley. So in comparison to the 2 wines we just tasted, we are looking at the opposite aspect. So the vineyards are higher elevation facing to the kind of southwest. And then we have totally different geology as well. What is the elevation range for Chalone?
It's 16 to 1,800 feet is all that. The appellation is actually very much defined by the elevation that it's on.
Right, and like you said, when we're talking about this marine influence, especially in the Santa Lucia Highlands, we're talking about this fog that kind of rolls in and covers the vineyard, and you guys are sitting above it. So I think if we go back to the first image, there's an image of that, or the first slide here. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right there. You can see that big puffy cloud is the Salinas Valley, and what you're looking at directly on the other side of that valley is Arroyo Seco. That kind of give you an idea of what you're looking at, or what we're looking at every day. And we see most of that marine layer is dying around 1,200 feet in elevation. So it's very common for me, driving to work to be in fog, and then all of a sudden you get to 1,200 feet and it's clear and it's you know, it's sunshine. And so we have a problem with an issue with sunburn that is on the morning side, which is very unique, because everything in Santa Lucia Highlands sees more of an afternoon side issue. And so it's a totally different beast up there. It's not like the rest of Monterey County. I would actually compare it a lot more similar to Calera and their growing region than I would anything in Monterey County.
Yeah.
Brenna and Johnny, you know, I hate to do this to you, but we have to move to our next winery. And guys, I see your questions. We will get to them at the end, but let's move to Ian and Brandon Family Winery, if that's okay, Brenna?
Yes, of course. Although I do want to also say the like tension and minerality in this wine is really, really beautiful. And
I know. It's paining me to not talk about it right now.
I know. We'll come back to it, but I didn't want to not say a comment about there is a beautiful structure to this wine, and it's really cool to what we just talked about.
I couldn't agree more. We will come back to that. We're going to move to Ian Brand, Brand and Family Winery, going to Albarino. I didn't think that was the land we were going to today, but I'm excited. Ian is a winemaker and owner of Brand and Family, located in the Santa Lucia Highlands, AVA. Connecticut native whose penchant for preserving older vineyards and promoting sustainable and organic vineyard management catapulted him to the very prestigious honor of San Francisco Chronicles 2018 Winemaker of the Year. I will say no more. Please do your thing, guys.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's delicious. And I have, again, kind of so many things to say. I spent a lot of time with Ian. So for this Albarino, we're specifically talking about this area just outside of Arroyo Seco. It's called Christie's Vineyard. That we'll kind of get back to a little more detail too in just a second. It's kind of this unassuming vineyard that kind of is just like right at the edge of kind of the valley floor. And I think it's a great metaphor for our entire conversation about Monterey County, to be honest, because, and Anne and I had spent a lot of time talking about this kind of, again, it's this kind of unassuming sense to it, but it has this kind of beautiful honesty. And I think a lot of Ian's wines, a lot of Ian's kind of mission and what he's doing with Monterey County follows that whole idea of kind of, there's a lot of bang for your buck. There's a lot more complexity. There's just a lot of hidden gems throughout Monterey County. And I think that's kind of what Ian's really doing. And I also kind of want to, maybe as we talk with Ian, we can go through this too. We spent a lot of time driving through Arroyo Seco and kind of talking about this major geologic change that's happening as we transition from kind of the Santa Lucia Highlands into this kind of southeastern, say, half of the valley. If we could go back quickly to the geologic map. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm all over the place. Okay, great. So we're in the Arroyo Seco appellation, is that kind of wobbly looking one labeled 3. I think Greenfield is the city that's just in the center of the valley off of it. And so there's 2 important geologic transitions that are happening here. One, we've moved outside of this Sierra de Salinas schist area, and we have, the Arroyo Seco drainage here, essentially, that kind of really breaks up the consistent slope of the valley. So we have this kind of major topographic shift, and then we're also moving again into this section of more marine sedimentary rocks. There is actually, so within that kind of, that really orangey layer that you see, that orangey color on the map that extends farther to the south, we're in marine sedimentary rocks, including the Monterey Shale, which is one of the most important rock types throughout all of California. And it does have little bits of limestone. So we have, in this sense, we're talking not about limestone that's been marbleized and put through hell, but kind of more typical marine sedimentary shale mixed in, marine sedimentary limestone mixed in with other marine sediments like shale and sandstone. And then we have this kind of unique climatic microclimate change of the Arroyo Seco area, as well as this other drainage where we get those greenfield potatoes, which maybe we'll talk about in a second, which are those kind of like they literally look, there's these rounded cobbles and you see these big piles of them, and they literally look like kind of piles of potatoes, which I think is awesome. And so in talking about the appellation itself and kind of trying to find ways to define it, that's kind of, we're looking at more of this transition into sedimentary rocks, greenfield potatoes, and topographic variations. And then if we specifically, if Ian, if you want to kind of introduce this wine, and then we can talk about the terroir a little bit more as well.
Sure. So this is the 2019 Christie's Vineyard Albarino. This is the Alt Cut. So we've been working with this vineyard. Steve Mcintyre farms it. We're a little unique in this seminar as we don't have any estates of our own, but we purchase fruit throughout the Salinas Valley, Monterey County, San Bernardino County, Santa Clara, and the Santa Cruz Mountains. And so we have kind of a wider vision of the terroir, and try and work in concert with the other work that's being done in order to kind of drive the perception of our area forward. So you don't see a lot of Pinot Noir from us. You don't see any Pinot Noir from us. The only St. Lucia Highlands fruit we get is from Scott's Vineyard. And we do a lot of vineyards off the beaten path. We do some work up in Chalone and try to find varieties and or vineyards that provide these lenses or these mediums to express more of what the area can do. In particular in the Salinas Valley, as we've kind of touched upon, there are a couple of qualities that we see as defining fruit from the Salinas Valley. Acid, salinity, aromatics, and that development of fruit that Steve was discussing with the C5 and C6 carbon chains. I don't know what the hell he was talking about, but it sounds really cool. So you have like good physiological ripeness at low sugars at high acid levels. And the thought process that brought us to Albarino is we were looking to find that could capture this that salinity, that acid, that sea air, that ripeness, and that beauty. We started working with this vineyard in 2011. Have made it every year since. At this point, I think we're making something like 1,600 cases of Albarino a year, which for a small family-owned independent winery is batshit. But it works. This particular bottle is a little bit nerdier. It's most of this lot goes into the main lot, but we held this apart. This is has 2 days of skin contact on it, 3 days of skin contact on it in 2019, and then was produced with the Pied de Cuve yeast. Setting up buckets in vine rows with crushed up grapes in there and cheesecloth over the top, and going down and hand punch them down and getting a fermentation going in the vineyard so that our native yeast isn't what you call winery native. It's an interesting expression. At this point in the year, I feel like it shows better than the main Albarino. The main Albarino tends to really peak in the summer and early fall months, go through a dumb phase in the winter, and then return the next summer into a kind of a different iteration. So I decided to send this one along. It's cold fermented in stainless, and then spends 6 or 8 months in barrel on lees, arrested malic.
Right. I don't think I tasted this one with you when I was there, but it's awesome. It's so good, and it's such a. And I kind of want to talk a little bit more about Christie's Vineyard in particular, and like how you found it and how you managed to kind of capture that, that Albarino quality with the kind of like that mid palate weight, like there is this kind of intensity and richness to it, but it's also, and I think with a little bit of skin contact, you kind of add that structure to it, and then that like bright acid and salinity, and it's like such a complete glass. Like there's just so much. Someone said this to me once, like there's just so much wine there. Like there's so much to experience. I think it's great. And I also, the vineyard is super cool, but what we talked about when we were there is like, we were just kind of driving around, and all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, and here it is. like in no way did I see it coming. In no way did I like expect to be there. Like it was just kind of, we're in the middle of this like kind of big, pretty flat, like alluvial fan. We're really pretty close to the valley floor. Like it's unassuming, but it's also really exceptional, which maybe if you can just comment on that.
Sure. I mean, the way I found it is I was working on the ideas I was discussing, and I called several growers, Steve being one of them, and said, okay, this is what I'm trying to express. What kind of things do you have that I can play with that would hit that expression? And this was one of 3 things that Steve threw at me. It was Albarino that he planted, I guess, more or less on a whim, in the middle of some Pinot and Chardonnay, which tend to be our, at least, main commodity cultivars. And something about the way the vineyard catches the wind and the soils within the vineyard made it make sense. In 2011, we took 4 tons. I thoroughly screwed up the fermentation. And it still was great and still sold out in about 2 months. And so I said, oh, I think there's something there. I'm going to learn how to make Albarino now. As the winemaking has evolved and moved back and forth, part of being independent and being your own boss is you can kind of get a wild hair and pursue it to a degree. The 19s, both in terms of the year and in terms of our winemaking, are the fleshiest that we've produced. In 2020, because of worries about fires and smoke taint, there's no skin contact. And so that'd be interesting kind of juxtaposition and 2020s in comparison had screaming acidity. Usually we're picking this vineyard somewhere around 21.5 bricks. And more, we're trying to wait for the TA to get down under 10. It's an issue that we encounter at a Skoll as well, where our acid levels are, when you learn to make wine in California, learn to make white wine in California, you're taught like a certain idea of acid alcohol balance. And in Monterey County, over the 13, 14 years that I'm working here, I've been progressively throwing out all those ideas of California winemaking because they don't make any goddamn sense here. And the big one is just the intensity of flavor, the varietal development combined with the intensity of acid. That you get at very low sugar levels. Mm-hmm. So I have to play around with that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Are we moving on?
We're gonna move on. I'll give you a second to just say, I think again, like the things that we've been talking about in glass, the concentration of these wines and the lift and the vibrancy, like again, even with this Albarino, still carrying through. But one last thought for you, Brenna, and then I'm gonna kick it over to James.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just leave this as again, hopefully we have some time at the end to come back, because another thing Ian and I, so kind of something to come back to specifically, another thing Ian and I talked about a lot, which you just touched on a little bit, and I think really the Albarino represents, is this idea of searching out different, beyond the Pinot Noir Chardonnay world of Monterey County, like searching out different varieties and how different varieties seem to maybe make sense. And this is something I'd like to talk about, that I wanted to talk about with Scott as well. We have been in this Pinot Noir Chardonnay conversation, which is so important for California and so important for Monterey. But Scott's also working with, I think a little bit of Gamay and a little bit of Syrah, and Ian is working with kind of searching out some of these other varieties that are less expected, but really make sense in terms of the geological setting. We're talking about granite and schist and some of these alluvial things as well, that I'd love to, maybe we can closing note.
Yeah, no, I think we'll go back and dive down. And I think the sommeliers out there are certainly thankful for all the different varieties that Ian, you're championing as well. But we'll move to the San Bernardino AVA, established in 2004 now with Diora and winemaker James Ewart. James, born in the Adelaide Hills. We love Australia. We're glad you're here now. Diora is famous for its Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays. We're going to be tasting the San Bernardino Vineyard Estate Pinot Noir today. This is actually the first San Bernardino appellated Pinot Noir. There's a lot to say about this. I think, Brenna, you've got a lot to say. James, you have a lot to say. We're running out of time, so I'm not going to say anything else. Pinot Noir glasses up. Let's do this.
Yes. Great. I'm so excited to talk about this. It really, we're really going in a great order of events. It was my last visit, but also, you know, Diora really spearheaded this whole idea and has really invested in this kind of educational journey that we've been on, and it really makes sense in so many ways. So again, we started in this northern portion of the Salinas Valley where these intense winds and this marine air originates, and it kind of, you know, powerfully blows down the valley. And as those winds bring this cold air, they bring something else with them. They bring sand and sediment that they pick up throughout the entire valley. So these winds are moving down. They are, you know, picking up steam. They're picking up all of these kind of sediments that have been sourced from the eastern side of the valley, from the western side of the valley, from the granites, from the schist, from the alluvial deposits, from the sediment. They're picking them all up, and kind of when it gets to the San Bernardino area, there is actually this big bend in the river, and the shape of oh yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is their kind of detailed estate map there on the right, and you see the Salinas River makes this huge bend, and it changes its direction, and the shape of the valley changes, and that transition of the shape of the valley actually kind of arrests the wind a little bit. And so all of that sediment, all of that sand that it's picked up gets deposited right here into this like huge sandy terrace. And you can see that this is an example from a soil pit that we dug in San Bernardino of just this aeolian or wind-blown sand that's essentially sourced from everywhere we've just been, which is kind of a great kind of culmination of things. That being said, you know, that's what defines this huge AVA that James will go into a little bit more detail in, that used to be all under one ownership and now it's kind of broken down. And that's kind of the overarching thing that brings this AVA together, is this windblown sand. But as you can see in the work that they're doing now, as they're really kind of fine-tuning their understanding of the vineyard, is seeing that there's actually a lot of other stuff going on as well. And that's kind of what they're working with this line of wines in terms of, you know, discussing the terroir and the kind of individual vineyard specificities throughout San Bernarby. So maybe
well,
James can then, okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brenna. You know, like Scott said, you know, we really enjoyed spending the afternoon walking the vineyards, looking at soil together and tasting wine with you back before Christmas. You know, I think I'm always learning something new at this vineyard. I've been here for about 20 years now, and you know, it's a fascinating place. First, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the transformation of the San Bernarby vineyard. You know, starting 30 years ago when the Indelicados first purchased the property. And as Brenna said, it's gone through a number of transformations since then. And we've actually sold off some of the land to other folks, and really concentrate and fine tune the best clones, the best rootstocks, the best trellis types for the particular area. As Brenna said, you know, the dominant soil type is the aeolian soil, or the Gary sandy loam. You know, this is the soil type kind of on the eastern side of that map that we have in front of us. It's kind of the browny grey area. And as Brenna said, it's like a sandpit. So those vines really have to work hard, and we manage it with our irrigation carefully throughout the growing season. So those vines are working pretty hard. And then we contrast to the western side, which are basically the foothills of the San Lucia mountain range, are the Lockwood Shaly loam soils. These are much heavier soils. They actually get quite sticky in the winter. Hopefully at the end of this week we'll get a big dose of rain to replenish the soils. But here the soils kind of give us wines with a little bit more texture in the wine, versus the aeolian soils on the bluff are kind of rounder textured wines. So the wine we have today is, as Amanda said, the 2008 San Bernardino Estate Pinot Noir. We only made 200 cases, and it's kind of the first of the AVA. So we're really proud of that wine. Roughly 60% comes from the Lockwood Shaly loam soils on the western side, really giving the kind of the framework to the palate, the soft tannins. These have also spent about 18 months in barrels, in French barrels. So these tannins have really had a good chance to soften out and become really nice and velvety. We do blend in some from the Gary sandy loam, the Aeolian soils. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this really adds some nice roundness to the texture of the wine. So with that, that's a very quick snapshot of a very complex AVA. So again, Brenna, thanks very much for coming down and teaching us a little bit more about the soil types.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. Thank you so much for having me and having these discussions. I think, I always come back to sand as being a really fascinating concept to talk about with wine. And I think it's actually, there's two really cool parallels to make here between both as the comparison to the Mcintyre Pinot Noir from the Santa Lucia Highlands and this as well. So we're changing our type of sand. We're also, like you said, James, we're also working with kind of your ability to balance this sand with another terroir in order to kind of balance out the structure. But we're also looking at this really significant climatic shift as well. And so I think you really feel that in the wines, and you feel it in, like you were saying, with the tannins as well. So here in San Bernarby, it's quite a bit warmer, but we still get these really big temperature swings, especially due to the power of those winds. So we're getting these big diurnal shifts, generally slightly warmer microclimate compared to the Santa Lucia Highlands. I think you see that reflected really in this softness of the tannins. But then there's also a conversation of I think it's your style as a reflection of that you're not in the Santa Lucia Highlands, you're in San Bernarby, and the goal is to kind of make this kind of more luxurious, more richer, softer Pinot Noir. And I think that there's so many important things to say with sand's role, right? Because if you look at really sandy soils, sandy terroirs in cooler climates, you're gonna lean towards, or kind of the thing you're gonna be fighting with those sandy terroirs is over austerity of the tannins, things getting really, really lean, because again, that sand, the temperature of that sand shifts so quickly, and because those soils are so, so lean, so weak, the water holding capacity is pretty minimal as well. Although here we're talking about really, really deep sands where I think there is more water at depth, versus here in San Bernarby where we're talking about something a bit warmer, and we're kind of leaning into the other side of sand, is that it can, when it's warm, it can be quite warm. So I kind of am interested in a little bit more about how you perceive kind of the textural sense of the sand in San Bernarby.
Yeah, thanks, Brenna. I think, as I mentioned, these soils are pretty low vigor soils. And I think in some cases, you mentioned that the wines can appear to be leaner. I think it kind of goes back to what Steve was saying a little bit earlier about, getting physiological ripeness. So, our viticulture team, Grant and Greg, do a great job of doing things in the vineyard, like planting cover crops and really trying to increase that organic matter so the vines can really fully reach that physiological ripening that I was saying earlier. And so it can kind of that austerity, that leanness can really be rounded out in the grapes when it comes time to picking, are fully ripe and not kind of halfway there, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and I think maybe kind of summarizing my slightly rambling statement there is, I guess kind of what's like crystallizing in my mind is this idea of, you know, we often want to kind of attribute something to the terroir, to sand. Like, what structure do we get from sandy soils? And we kind of want to make that a rule. Whereas I think what we've kind of maybe unintentionally done here is we've kind of shown an example of how there are these qualities that come from sand, but how they can be kind of mitigated by things like slight changes in climate. And, you know, obviously there's different sources to the sand as well, and where you can get, you know, that's what terroir really is. It's this kind of complete expression of a place. And I think that that's, you know, the difference that's happening in these two Pinot Noirs is these complete expressions of different places. You know, the nuances in the different types of sand, and the nuances in the microclimate, and how you have two totally different styles. So there's, you know, you can do, and with, I think that's important to think about in terms of Pinot Noir from Monterey County, where maybe there are these overarching similarities of that concentration and still getting concentration and freshness. But you can also kind of see this nuance in this, you know, gradation between, you know, opulence and kind of, you know, softness versus austerity, and how all of those things have a place here. I think it's just a beautiful example of a different piece of Monterey County that's very unique to itself.
I couldn't agree more, Brenna. Thank you for pointing that out. And I think, as you know, we're drinking these wines, there is, especially this one, there is a richness and intensity and concentration. It's been sort of the calling card of this appellation through and through. But, you know, again, looking at all of these different wines, they've all had a signature marker about them. There's no two that we've tasted two Pinot Noirs throughout this, and they're, you know, though they were both intense, though they were both, you know, rich and concentrated, they couldn't be more different. You put them side by side and you definitely see that. So, you know, despite having richness and intensity, you're still getting this massive representation of terroir in the glass. We are going to continue through doing Q&A, and obviously if we've got more questions for James, let's throw them out there. But I do want to turn it over to Greg really quick, being mindful of time since we had an official end at 2:30, because there is a quiz, and I think Greg has just put that up in the chat. So Greg's going to say a quick little something, and then we're going to spin it back around to the Q&A. So all of those questions that you guys have been asking throughout this, and we really, really appreciate them, we are going to circle back to those just as soon as Greg talks. So go ahead, Greg.
Perfect. Well, first off, I just want to say how exciting it was to really check out all of the different geology and to check out the wines. I just posted the test link in the chat box, so everybody should have that now. So basically the way it works, you have until 2 p.m. Pacific to take it today. Please check out the virtual tour on our website if you haven't. That'll definitely help you there. And then also just a bit of housekeeping. Please do not do the same IP address or the same person with different emails. We want it to be fair for everybody, and so please do that. But basically it'll be 30 questions, and then the person who answers the most correct and also the quickest has a chance for the 2 $500 scholarships, as well as the top 5 access to the global diagram of wine. And exciting wines, and honestly, I saw a lot of these questions through the Q&A in the chat box, and I'm actually really excited to get some answers to a couple of them.
Yeah, me too. I thank you, Greg. And like I said before, we are going to be continuing this through the Q&A. Just definitely wanted to get that link out there and Greg out there. Thank you to SommFoundation and all of the panelists for joining us today. Do not go anywhere. We're going to continue with this Q&A. Brenna, I'm going to kick it back to you since you were sort of mid-thought with James there. Was there anything else you wanted to touch on as far as San Bernardi or Diora?
You know, I think that the other kind of maybe as sort of a concluding statement about all these things is the one thing we didn't really specifically talk about with all these different producers is I think there's a really incredible example of variety of all of these different vineyards. And I think that that's maybe just the last like missing piece in terms of talking about Monterey that we haven't touched on, is that there is, you know, we keep coming back to this concept of, you know, like it's this kind of hidden gem, and there's all this stuff going on. There's this agricultural foundation of the region that to me, like a lot of it really felt like, it really kind of felt like the Jura to me, not in terms of what the geology actually was or even the taste of the wine, but the cultural setting and the cultural climate of it was very Jurassian, or I'm not sure what the French word for that is, but Jurassic, but I didn't want to say that. But it, you know, this idea of there's the benchlands and there's this this deep agricultural, you know, kind of, you know, row crop history to it, and wine kind of takes the second seat to all of this. But it's also so important, and there's just so much opportunity, and there's so much to discuss. And I think that, you know, it also, because of that and because of the price point and because it's kind of a hidden gem, you see this, it's, to me, it's over and over it's been this like ability to bring terroir to the people. And I think that that's what, even on all of these different scales, that's kind of what everyone is really doing. This, like, the ability to make the conversation of terroir accessible to a different audience has been something that really moves me. Like, unfortunately, you know, like, terroir is a French word. It's kind of snobby to say in the first place. You know, like, I think almost like I get uncomfortable about this, like, almost like elitist nature of talking about it. But the reality is it's there. It's at all of these different scales. There is terroir, there's expression of place in all of these different styles of wines, from, you know, small bottlings to larger scale bottlings. And I think that that's like the thing that I'm most excited about for Monterey moving forward, is this ability to taste terroir at scale, to taste terroir in a way that's, you know, you don't have to have the fanciest bottle of wine in the world. It's all there. So that's kind of what I'm moving towards, I guess.
I think that's a brilliant takeaway, Brenna. And I think, you know, Monterey is definitely going to be one of those places moving forward where more and more people with the budgets that are more in line with, you know, the median or average of what consumers are spending can access terroir and drink it in the glass, and, you know, it be available readily, whether they're going to, you know, their local super, you know, tiny little shop, or something that's, you know, maybe offers a wider selection. So I love that you highlighted that, because I think that was one of my takeaways as I was going through these. I was looking at the price and I was looking at, you know, where some of these wines are available. And I'm like, you know, that's really cool that I can send, you know, my mom, who's maybe down in Florida, you know, to go get a bottle of wine and ask her, like, what are you tasting? And it really be about terroir and expression. So thank you for pointing that out. I want to dive back to one of these questions, which was a wonderful one from Jason Charles. With the sand content of the soil, is San Bernardino primarily planted with own rooted vines? James or Brenna, can you speak to that?
No, most of the vines are on rootstocks. You know, not only for phylloxera, but probably more so nematodes on the very sandy soils. So they are planted to rootstocks.
And then just to follow up, Mary had asked, how much of San Bernarby do you farm, James?
So we farm about 1,800 acres.
Okay.
In Bernarby. So the whole AVA is about 25,000 acres. Okay.
So you know, a smaller chunk of a large, that's a big AVA.
It is a big AVA. So yeah, we really, and I mentioned we sold off some parts of the original property. We've really kind of kept kind of the north and western part of the property. So we've got really good diversity, as I said earlier, between the aeolian soils and then kind of the hillside plantings there.
I love how focused you guys have become. I think it's really exciting. And I also read that you were in charge of the construction of the small winery in the middle of the San Bernardi vineyard.
Yes. I should have said that because that is to try and understand the diversity within our vineyard with, you know, the 7 different soil types. One of the key is to kind of keep not only the blocks separate, but also the clones separate, you know, right the way through the winemaking process. So yeah, about 10 years ago, you know, when we created Jura, we also created a small open top fermentation winery at the property. So again, to really give us an insight into those differences throughout the vineyard.
And there are some differences. We are going to back up to Eric's question. Hopefully, Eric, you're hanging in there. Your question about Chalone, and I know, Brenna, you've been dying to go back to Chalone, as have I. So we'll kick it off with this question, which is a good one. How old are the oldest Pinot Noir and Chardonnay plots, and does the juice go into both reserve and regular wines. So Johnny.
Well, the oldest vines on the vineyard are planted in 1919. Those are actually Chenin Blanc vines. But the Chardonnay that goes into the wine we tasted today was replanted with some cuttings from a planting that happened in 46. But most of the vines were planted in the 70s and 80s.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, older wines that can age. I mean, I've had, like I mentioned before, I've had Chalon back to the 70s and 80s, both Pinot and Chardonnay, and they are ageable, wonderful wines. And Brenna, I know we were trying to wax poetic about what was going on in the glass before, so I'll let you go back to that if you'd like.
Yeah, well, I actually have, I was wondering if Jenny, you could also talk about I think relating to this question as well, talk about the terroir of the Chardonnay specifically. So like we have these like dramatic differences in terroir throughout the vineyard. So what are we dealing with here?
Well, I think the biggest difference throughout the vineyard is the varying amount of limestone that's in the soil. So, you know, we have some blocks of a block called Vista that has a lot of limestone, and we get a lot more of this kind of salinity out of the wine, and then some other blocks that have less limestone that we get more of a almost like a pear kind of a flavor. But I think the biggest difference I notice in the concentration of the wines coming off the vineyard has to do with the age of the vines. There's a really direct correlation between the age of the vine and the sort of thickness or richness in the wine.
Yeah, and so in terms of this bottling, so that's something that you play with the limestone content as you balance out, or is that something that's isolated and highlighted in certain bottlings? It's so complex to see in the vineyard too, actually.
Well, there's like this particular bottling has some old plantings on the vineyard that are a lot more mineral driven, and it's balanced out with another block that was replanted in the 89 from clone 76, excuse me, that has a lot more of a fruit driven character to it. And then another thing that's interesting about this wine is I'm going against the old school way of making Chalon. Chalon is typically 100% malolactic fermented. This wine, it only goes partially through that fermentation, so I'm sort of preserving more of that sort of apple or pear flavor and some more of the acidity in the wine, because we are dealing with extreme temperatures, and so I'm trying to keep as much acid in the wine as I can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really get the pear, kind of apple pear, and then I just can't say enough, just the beautiful like minerality and tension to the wine. It really like sits very, very high on your palate, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Without losing anything in the middle, which I think is the key here, right? Like, and not to go on and on about this, but like what really strikes me is just the depth of this wine. You know, sometimes we talk about like donut wines, you know, they have all the great things that we want as far as brightness and acidity, but they sort of lack that center component. In this wine, which I think, you know, has been a Chalon thing, and I think Monterey County, now that we're tasting through all of these wines, you know, you really get all of that deep flavor that carries through years and years and years and makes them, you know, wonderful wines for aging. Alicia had asked how many trials to find the correct rootstock suitable to the environment at Chalon. I mean, based on the pictures and what Brenna was talking about, I can't even imagine what that was like.
Well, a lot of the rootstock choices have to do with the tolerance of the calcium carbonate or the limestone in the soil. So a lot of the old plantings were on St. George, and a lot of the newer ones are on 1103. So these are rootstocks that can handle the limestone, and we get a varying amount of that sort of impression of the limestone because of the soils are so alkaline. We get a lot more of that mineral driven flavor on the drier years, and then on the years with more rainfall, we get more of a fruit driven character out of those wines because of the leaching of those minerals out of the soil.
Sort of speaking of pH and limestone, Jose Delgado had asked, is there a relation to high pH limestone soils and a vine's level of photosynthesis, hence high acid wines? I don't know if that's...
Well, we because we're dealing with so much heat, we don't have very high acids. We have to acidulate the wines to make those nice age-worthy wines, especially with the way I make the wines. I think maybe some of the previous winemakers might have picked a lot earlier and had a little bit more of the malic in the wine. And I do pick a little bit riper and then actually have to acidulate the wines.
Brenna, any other remarks on Chalon? Because we have a few questions about Craccioli that I'd like to get to as well.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So we'll dive back to Craccioli cellars and the sparkling wine. So Scott, you're on deck. Question from Gianluca: how do you manage the discouragement of malolactic fermentation given the warmer temperatures of the area, i.e. sulfur, cellar temps, etc.? So winemaking question, but interesting.
Everything stays pretty cold, and in general, my vineyard doesn't really want to go through it because of the low pH, high acid anyway. So it actually kind of happens relatively organically, given like control of temperature.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then Stacy had sort of had a question as well about clonals and site selections. Would you say it's more about clonal or site selection to get that specificity, or a combination of both?
It's both. I have the same clone from the same nursery in different spots of the vineyard on the same rootstock that do different things. So it's very much a elevation and then also a site specific within the overall vineyard.
As far as I had a question just about aging. So this was aged 4 years on the lees?
Correct.
Have you guys played around with extended aging or anything like that, or has it been pretty consistent with that amount of time? I'm just curious with the soil and with the terroir, if that's something that you're interested to see if it can hang longer, or if shorter actually sort of gives it a different profile.
I have played with it. I've done trials at 36 months compared to 48 months. I've also got some stuff going longer than 48 months. Michelle Salg, who is our founding winemaker from Roeder, was a firm believer that at some point you hit a point of diminishing returns in terms of lees aging, and that actually some of the great autolytic characteristics that you get occur under cork. So most of our vintages historically have been 4 years on lees and then a year on cork prior to release. That said, I am kind of playing with certain lots and certain cuvées and seeing exactly if more lees aging would behoove them in the long run.
I would definitely be curious to see that. I'm also curious, I've had back to 2012 recently of these wines. I'm very curious to see aging just in general of how they do, because I think these wines just have so much character and so much, so much breath, but the lift and the vibrancy of them just is incredible to me. And I was thrilled to have tasted them the first time only, a few months ago. Brenna, any other remarks on Craccioli?
Yeah, Steve, I was hoping we could also take a quick second for you to also talk about sort of some of the success in your experiments with other varieties, and that's kind of what we can lead into. I know you have a little Syrah that we tasted that was great, and in the future some Gamay as well.
Yeah, so I've got a couple acres planted to Gamay and got about 5.5 to Syrah now. I started grafting in 2018, a couple blocks that had more of the organic material and the geologic composition that I thought would behoove Syrah, and I've been really excited about what's come out of that. I have a little Viognier that actually I fermented this year also, that was to co-ferment with Syrah, but no red wine in a fire year. So that was kind of fun to see how that turned out in barrel, and it was extremely varietal. And then I also put a couple acres of Gamay last year, and I'll get to play with it a little bit more this year. But I think just the overall scope of where it is in the vineyard and the DG that's present in that block, that it works in that pocket of where we're at.
Yeah, I'm super excited to taste. You know, I love the concept of kind of this, you know, comparison of, we have this kind of decomposed granitic sandy terroirs, but yet, you know, where you would see things like in the Northern Rhone and in Beaujolais, but also how that relates to with this kind of marine influence that you have in the San Lucia Highlands. It's going to be really fun to taste along with.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I'm
Brenna.
excited. One quick note for those who are going to be doing the quiz, and I hope you will. The scholarship winners will be posted on SommFoundation's website on Wednesday afternoon. So that's when you can look for the winners there. I think we should head over to Mcintyre, because I saw we have a few questions for Steve. So Steve, you're on deck, and Brenna, if you had any final remarks or anything you wanted to add that was missed. Question from Alder Yarrow. For Steve, how much of the prime terroir in Santa Lucia Highlands has been planted, and how much great land remains unplanted to grapes?
Well, there's actually quite a bit of citrus that's planted in the Santa Lucia Highlands. There's just over 1,000 acres of mostly lemons and avocados, and they compete on an economic basis quite well with wine grapes. So right now there's about 5,000 acres, 5,200 acres planted of grape. I think, you know, there's probably another 1,800 and we'd be topped out, and the appellation would be full.
All right, duly noted. And then also for you, Steve, do you see any difference in berry size because of the wind?
You know, not so much in berry size, but you certainly can see it in terms of set. You know, if it's really windy during May when the vines are flowering and going through fruit set, it definitely can have an impact on not just the temperature, but physically probably knocking some berries off of the vine or flowers off of the vine.
Brenna, this is probably something that you guys can both touch on. Maybe not, this is more general. What is the name of the winds, speaking of winds, that affect the Salinas Valley, and are there other winds for different sub-AVAs?
Well, I'll take a crack at it first. Other than a pejorative name for the wind, when you open both doors of your vehicle and half the contents ends up in the next town, you know, down the road. I don't think there's actually an official name for it. Maybe that's a good contest for our Santa Lucia Highlands anniversary coming up next year.
Yeah, that's a name. I love that.
I've heard them referred to as howlers on more than one occasion.
Yes, that's great.
Brenna, anything you wanted to remark on as far as Mcintyre and any further SLH comments? I can rewind to any slides as well if you need me to.
Sure. I mean, my main kind of what was great with talking with Steve is his kind of the broad understanding he has about kind of these climatic variations throughout. You know, we had a long conversation about how the storms kind of come in, you said clockwise, and so there's huge differences in rainfall from one side of the valley to the next. And I'm afraid it's maybe too long-winded of a conversation, but it's just such a you're such a depth of knowledge of everything that's going on, and you know, I can't wait to kind of talk to you more about how some of these things interplay with changes in the geology and things like that. If there are any major things that jump out to you, but mostly just thank you for all of your time and information that you shared with me.
Well, thank you, Brenna. I guess that means I'm old, so I'll own it.
Well, the people want to know, Mr. Mcintyre, are you interested in growing any other varieties besides Albarino?
Yeah, as a company, we grow 21 different varieties, including 2 acres of Dornfelder on our estate vineyard, which a buddy of mine's been making for years. So a few funny esoteric varietals.
That's great. That's like a perfect, that's again, kind of what I spent a lot of time talking with Ian about too. It's maybe kind of like a perfect transition into, like, you know, Ian, you have your hands in all of these different interesting parts of the valley and parts of things that are going on. What's most exciting to you, and what are some of the reasons that you're drawn in those directions?
Wow. You know, you try to think of one thing as more or less exciting. Different years, different places tend to show well. I think what's most exciting is the overall trend over the last 10 years in terms of a greater view. You know, it's a rather large growing region. It's the second highest number of acres of vine grapes, second to Sonoma. And it's interesting because you do have some very large growers like Steve, who are very good growers and have a willingness and have shown a willingness to look into esoteric varieties, to adapt their farming styles to kind of more responsible, lower input farming, but also have like that weight and that heft to actually make a difference. So that part of the valley is very exciting. In terms of varieties and places, a lot of the work I've been trying to do is to softly push away from some of the more commoditized varieties and into varieties that make more sense in those general areas. Monterey has kind of been stuck in the Pinot and Chard in the north, and then Cabernet in the south. There are areas that are excellent for those varieties, but many of the areas that are under those varieties are not. So finding things that, if you have that appropriate match of soil to variety to climate, it makes farming a lot easier. It makes winemaking a lot easier. And it makes putting a great glass of wine in the, in a person's hand at a great price much easier. And so, it's interesting in the St. Lucia Highlands, when Davis first did analysis of the Highlands in the 70s, what they recommended was Gamay and Riesling. Touching back on some of those granitic soils in the Alsace and in Beaujolais. The Gamay that they got in the Highlands was Gamay Beaujolais clone Pinot Noir, which is a low quality upright growing Pinot Noir clone, which is not Gamay at all. And there was some Riesling, a lot of own rooted Riesling planted in the Highlands in the 70s. American Riesling continues to be very difficult wine to move en masse in the market. But there are other things around here with the increased sunlight and heat events with global warming. Grenache is starting to become a very good variety for the area. I've been playing with Syrahs and Grenaches in Chalon and seen some more beds up there that really excel. Chenin Blanc was planted in Chalon in 1919, and right now some of the best Chenin Blancs I see in the States come out off that Chalon bench. In the Salinas Valley in particular, really looking at aromatic whites. And so some of your Spanish and Italian whites that can deal with that heat and yield with acid and aromatic complexity. I guess heat's the wrong terms. It's not really hot, but what you're really looking for are vines that can ripen in that mid-September to mid-October period.
Yeah, and sunshine. The solar radiation.
Yes.
But with the kind of cold wind, it's an interesting combination.
that it is, yeah.
One thing that I really want to highlight that you just said that was actually really I think will be like a very formative conversation that you and I had together, that you kind of said, you mentioned something about finding other varieties that aid in the ease of farming. Mm-hmm. And I really love that. Something that I really took to heart was this concept of, instead of pushing into, trying to make something work, like how you can find what fits naturally and makes farming easier, because that's really the key. I mean, and that's really the key to everything I want to do with my work is how you can make farming easier so you can have fewer inputs, and at the same time you can decrease the price, and then more people can have access to this. And I think that was like a light bulb moment for me of how we can make this concept accessible and how that's really practical. It's always really fun to talk about how you taste terroir, but you taste terroir because what you're tasting how the vine is experiencing life in different ways, you know? So it's how we can use terroir to, you know, to improve farming and to improve winemaking.
Yeah, and with the scale, with the size of plots and scale of the business here, and the farming acumen that we have in Monterey, this is really a perfect place to really test those theories.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of, that also brings us into the conversation with Diora as well. It's like this perfect link, because there's this kind of, you know, this concept of scale, and Diora has some, you know, the wine that we tasted is a, you know, is obviously a very precisely made wine, you know, for a smaller batch compared to what the rest of the company does. But really what they're doing is they're bringing terroir, and they're bringing, you know, to this larger scale, this concept of, you know, where you can still work with vineyard specificity. You can still work with looking at changes in terroir and looking at how you can farm those things on a, you know, in a practical, you know, more straightforward way, and you can see that reflected in the wine, which I think is, it's an incredible, you know, to kind of look at kind of what you're doing and what Diora is doing and what everyone's doing is, it's all, you know, very comparable, even though the scales of it are very different. I think that's, to me, that was the Monterey takeaway.
I think it's a perfect takeaway, Brenna, and impressive, exciting, all of the above. I think, you know, it's why I think we all love wine and being in the wine business, because it never changes and there's always something exciting. And, you know, Monterey's been around for a while, but it's nice to have the opportunity to talk about it in this light and shed a little bit more light, of course, with your incredible contributions and that beautiful map and all of your incredible talents that you bring with that. So in the interest of time, we are at 2 hours, which flew by. I don't know where it went. We drank some wine. Hopefully you guys did too. But thank you to all of our panelists, Ian, Steve, Scott, Johnny, Brenna, thank you so much. Who did I miss? Oh, Greg and James, thank you guys for being here today. Like I said, the winners of those scholarships will be posted on SommFoundation's website on Wednesday, along with a global diagram of wine links, and then I believe the recording of this as well will be posted. Greg, let me know if I messed that up at all. Good. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Brenna. Thank you, panelists. Steve, I see you're trying to like prune your virtual screen back there, so I'm gonna let you go. I think you're eager to go back.